It was 3 in the morning when Margaret heard it. She hadn't been sleeping. She rarely slept well in winter. The Ashford townhouse was old, the walls were thin, and the cold found its way in no matter how many fires were kept burning. She'd been lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, when the sound came from the room next door. A voice. Edward's voice. She sat up. He'd taken ill 2 days ago. Nothing serious, the doctor had said. A winter fever, rest and warmth, and it would pass in a week. She'd arranged everything. A nurse for the nights, extra blankets, broth sent up from the kitchen at regular intervals. She was a good duchess. Nobody could say she wasn't a good duchess. She'd sent the nurse home at midnight because the woman's breathing was too loud and it was keeping her awake through the wall. Now she wished she hadn't, because Edward was talking in his sleep. She couldn't make out words at first, just the shape of them, the murmur of a man lost somewhere between fever and dreaming. She put on her robe and stood at the connecting door and listened. Then she heard it, clear as anything. A name. Clara. Margaret's hand went still on the door handle. Clara. Again. Softer this time, the way you said a name when you weren't trying to say it, when it simply came out, because it lived somewhere so deep that even sleep couldn't keep it down. She stood at the door for a long time, then she went back to bed. She lay in the dark, and she looked at the ceiling, and she said nothing and did nothing, and her face in the darkness was very, very still. In the morning, Edward was better. Not well, pale, a little unsteady, the fever broken, but the weakness still in him. He came down to breakfast because he hated staying in bed, and she'd learned long ago that arguing with him about it was a waste of energy. She poured his coffee. She asked about his night. He said it was restless, fever dreams. He couldn't remember much of it. She smiled. "You should rest today," she said. "Don't push yourself. I have the Pemberton meeting. I'll send word that you're unwell." She looked at him pleasantly across the breakfast table. "They'll understand." He looked at her, a brief look, the kind they exchanged often, the kind that meant nothing and everything, the look of two people who had been polite to each other for 2 years and had gotten very good at it. "Thank you," he said. "Of course," she said. She went to write the letter to the Pembertons, and she sat at her writing desk, and she held her pen, and she thought about a name said in the dark, and what it meant, and what she was going to do about it. Clara. She knew exactly one Clara, and if Margaret was anything, she was a woman who dealt with problems before they dealt with her. She'd been 17 when she'd first heard of Clara Voss. Not from Edward. Edward hadn't told her anything. Edward had been presented to her as a suitable match, and she'd accepted, and that was the whole of their courtship, which suited her perfectly well. No, she'd heard of Clara Voss from her mother, 3 months before the engagement was announced, in the sitting room of their house in Belgravia. "There's a girl," her mother had said. "Edward Ashford has been seeing a girl. A nobody. A music teacher's daughter from somewhere in Hampshire." Margaret had set down her embroidery. And it needs to stop," her mother had said, "before it becomes a problem." It had taken 4 months. It hadn't been difficult. Not really, when you had the right connections and the right access and a clear understanding of where a girl like Clara Voss was vulnerable. Her father's debts. A rumor placed in the right ear. A letter, carefully worded, suggesting that Edward's feelings had cooled, that he was being pressured by his family and would never stand against them, that she should save herself the humiliation of waiting for something that wasn't coming. Clara Voss had left London quietly in the spring. Edward had married Margaret in the autumn. And that, Margaret had thought at the time, was that. She picked up her pen. She thought about a name in the dark.
Apparently, she thought, that was not that. She found out where Clara was by Wednesday. It wasn't difficult. A woman like Clara Voss, educated, limited income, good family name gone to seed, had a limited number of options. She taught piano. She had 3 pupils in Mayfair, 1 in Kensington, and 1, Margaret's pen stopped moving when she read this name, 1 in the house of Lady Grantham. Lady Grantham, who had hosted the Ashford dinner last month, who was having another dinner in 3 weeks, to which Edward had already accepted the invitation. Margaret folded the paper. She set it in the fire. She watched it burn with the patience of a woman whom had always known that certain things, once started, eventually came back around. She was going to have to deal with Clara Voss. Again.
Edward didn't know any of this. He was in his study by Thursday, mostly recovered, going through the correspondence that had piled up in 3 days of illness. He worked through it steadily, efficiently. Estate matters, parliamentary business, a letter from his sister in Bath. At the bottom of the pile, a note from Lady Grantham, a reminder about the dinner. So looking forward to seeing you both. He set it aside. He looked at the window, at the gray January street outside, the carriages passing, the bare trees in the square. He thought about the fever dreams he couldn't remember. He'd woken up on Wednesday morning with a specific feeling, the feeling of having been somewhere else entirely, somewhere warm and vivid and real, and then having lost it the moment his eyes opened. He couldn't retrieve it, just the feeling, just the faint residue of something that had mattered enormously and was now gone. He shook his head, went back to his correspondence. In 3 weeks he would walk into Lady Grantham's dining room. He didn't know yet what was waiting for him there. But somewhere across the city, in a small room above a Kensington music shop, a woman named Clara Voss was teaching a child to play scales, and thinking, as she often did when her hands were busy and her mind went quiet, about a spring 2 years ago when she had packed a bag and left London without looking back. She had looked back. She just hadn't let anyone see it. Clara Voss had a laugh that arrived before she intended it. That was the first thing Edward noticed about her. Not her face, though her face was worth noticing, and not the way she played, which was extraordinary. The laugh, sudden, genuine, slightly surprised at itself, like it had escaped before she could decide whether the situation warranted it. He'd decided then and there that he was in trouble. They'd met at a musical evening at the Hartleys, one of those gatherings where the music was the excuse and the socializing was the point. Clara had been playing, not performing, not showing off, just playing with the focused pleasure of someone doing the thing they loved in front of people who happened to be there. Edward had stood at the back of the room and listened, and forgotten entirely that he'd been in the middle of a conversation with someone whose name he could no longer remember. Afterward, he'd found a reason to speak to her. He couldn't recall what the reason was, something about the piece she'd played, a question about the composer. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd answered directly, without the usual performance of modesty, and then asked him a question back, and then laughed at something he said. That laugh, the one that arrived ahead of her, and 40 minutes later they were still talking, and the room had mostly emptied around them. Her father was a music teacher, Hampshire family, good name, no money to speak of. She taught piano to supplement the household income, and she read voraciously, and she had opinions about everything, and she shared them with a directness that he found, after years of careful social conversation, like water after a long thirst. He called on her father 2 weeks later. Her father, who was a gentle, unworldly man who loved his daughter completely, had looked at the Duke of Harrow sitting in his small parlor and said, quietly, "She's not the kind of girl who'll be comfortable being a duchess, Your Grace. I want you to know that before you go any further." Edward had said, "I know.
I'm hoping she'll be comfortable being my wife. The Duchess part is incidental." Her father had liked that. Clara had taken longer. She hadn't made it easy, which was one of the things he loved about her. She'd asked him, point blank, at their third meeting, they were walking in the park, her idea, "I think better when I'm moving," what exactly he was doing. "Courting you," he said. "Why?" she said. "Because I haven't been able to think about anything else since the Hartley evening." She'd looked at him sideways. "That could just be the music." "It isn't the music." She'd looked away, hidden a smile. He'd seen it anyway. It had taken 3 more months before she'd let herself believe he meant it. He understood why. The gap between them was obvious and real, and she wasn't naive about what it meant. She'd seen how these things went. Dukes married other dukes' daughters. Whatever this was, it had an expiration date, and she was quietly waiting for it. He'd proposed in her father's parlor on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with no audience and no ceremony, just him and her and the question. She'd said yes.
And then she'd laughed, that laugh, sudden and genuine and slightly amazed, and said, "I can't believe I'm saying yes." "I can," he said. She'd looked at him. "I've been saying it in my head for 2 months," he said. That was the only time he ever saw Clara Voss cry happy tears, just briefly, just once. It lasted 4 months. He should have seen it coming. He told himself afterward that he should have seen it. The dinner with his parents where his mother had been too gracious, too warm, the specific warmth of a woman managing a situation. The conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. His father requesting a private meeting and then talking for an hour about responsibility and legacy and what the title requires, without ever quite saying Clara's name. He told himself it was just the adjustment, just the family coming around. Then Clara's father called on him. He came to the townhouse on a Wednesday morning, hat in hand, with the look of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and found it was harder than expected. He sat in the study and he told Edward, quietly, that a significant debt had materialized, an old account called in suddenly, the kind of thing that could ruin a small household overnight. Edward had offered immediately to help. Clara's father had shaken his head, said it had already been arranged, that a settlement had been reached, that there were conditions to the settlement. He hadn't said what the conditions were. He hadn't needed to. Clara told him herself. She came to see him 2 days later, unannounced, which she'd never done, and he knew before she opened her mouth that something had broken. She stood in the middle of his study, and she looked at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before. Not angry, not crying, just clear. The way people looked when they'd made a decision, and the decision had cost them everything, and they weren't going to let it show how much. "I've had a letter," she said. "From whom?" "It doesn't matter." She looked at her hands. "It said that your family will never accept this, that your mother has already approached 3 other families, that this has been," she stopped, "that I've misunderstood the nature of it." "That's not true," he said immediately. "Clara, none of that is your mother approaching other families?" Silence. He wanted to say no. The word was right there. But he'd had lunch with his mother on Monday, and she'd mentioned the Haverstock girl, casually in passing, and he hadn't said anything, because he hadn't known what to say, because he was 26 and the Duke of Harrow, and the weight of what that meant had been pressing on him his whole life. He didn't say no. The silence was long enough. Clara nodded. Once. The nod of someone receiving information they already knew. "I see," she said. "It doesn't mean," he started. "Edward." His name. Quiet. Final. "Don't." She left 20 minutes later. He stood at the window and watched her go down the front steps and along the street and around the corner and out of sight. He told himself he would fix it. Tomorrow he would fix it. He would go to his parents and he would make it clear, and He married Margaret Cavendish in October. He hadn't fixed anything. He'd thought about Clara every day since. Not dramatically, not with the anguish of a man in a novel, not with any outward sign that anyone could see. Just the ordinary, daily, quiet thought of her. What she was doing. Whether she was well. Whether she'd found something good. Something that the situation he'd failed to fight for had somehow not entirely ruined. He hoped so. He hoped so every day. He didn't know, sitting in his study with Lady Grantham's letter in his pile, that in 3 weeks he was going to walk into a room and find out. Lady Grantham's dinners were always too warm. It was a known thing. Her guests accepted it the way they accepted most of her eccentricities, with good humor and slightly loosened collar buttons. The house on Cavendish Square ran hot in winter, every fireplace stoked to capacity, and by the second course you were always grateful you'd worn something light. Edward stood at the edge of the drawing room in the pre-dinner hour, the 40 minutes of standing and talking that preceded the actual meal, with a glass of wine he wasn't drinking and a conversation about parliamentary reform he wasn't following, and he thought about how much he disliked these evenings. Not the people, the performance of it, the careful, continuous performance of being exactly who everyone expected you to be. Margaret was across the room, luminous in green silk, saying something that made the woman beside her laugh. She was very good at this, better than him, if he was honest. She moved through rooms like she'd been born in them, which he supposed she had. He turned toward the window, and that was when he saw her. She was coming in from the music room. He knew this because the music room opened off the far end of the drawing room, and its door was just swinging closed, and Clara was smoothing her gloves in the particular way of someone who had just finished something and was transitioning back into the world. She hadn't seen him yet. He had perhaps 4 seconds to look at her. She was the same. That was his first thought, which was both obvious and not. 2 years was 2 years. People changed. But Clara was the same in the ways that had mattered. The directness in how she held herself. The slight angle of her chin that meant she was thinking. The dark hair, simply done. No nonsense about it. She looked not well. Not quite. A little thin. A little careful, the way people looked when they'd been managing something hard for a while, and had gotten so used to managing it that it didn't show anymore except to someone who knew where to look. He knew where to look. Then she looked up. He watched it happen, the moment she registered him. It moved across her face in about 1 second, through several things he recognized and 1 or 2 he couldn't name. Surprise first, genuine, unguarded. Then something that shut over the surprise like a door closing. Then, and this was the part he would think about later, lying in the dark, a single, brief, uncontrollable flash of something that was not indifference, not even close to indifference. And then Clara Voss looked away. Looked back, because looking away had been too obvious and she knew it. Looked at him with the expression of a woman who had decided what face to wear and was wearing it. "Your Grace," she said, when the distance between them had closed enough to require it. Her voice was exactly as he remembered, low, precise, the voice of someone who thought before she spoke. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Miss Voss," he said. He said it, and the name in his own mouth was something. He didn't examine what. "Lady Grantham's daughter," she said. "I've been giving her lessons for 2 months." "She plays well," he said. "I heard her last week in the music room." "She works hard," Clara said. "That counts for more than playing well." A pause. The kind of pause that happened when 2 people had approximately 40 things to say and had agreed, without discussing it, to say none of them. "You're well?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Yes," he said. They looked at each other. 2 years of letters never sent. 2 years of "I should have" and "I didn't" and "I wonder if she's," and here she was, 3 feet away, in Lady Grantham's drawing room, both of them saying yes and well like polite strangers. "I should," she started. "Of course," he said. She moved away. He stayed where he was. He looked at the window again, at nothing in particular. His wineglass was very cold in his hand. Margaret had been watching since the door opened. She was good at watching without appearing to. Years of practice. Social gatherings were, in her experience, primarily intelligence operations dressed in evening clothes, and she had always been better at them than anyone gave her credit for. She'd seen Edward first, seen the stillness that came over him when someone caught his eye across a room, a particular stillness, the one he never used with her, the one she'd noticed before she understood what it meant. She'd followed his gaze, and there was Clara Voss. Older than Margaret had imagined, prettier if she was being honest, which she generally tried not to be about things like this. There was a quality to her, a self-possession, something in how she stood that Margaret found immediately, instinctively irritating. She watched the conversation. The whole thing lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Nothing in it was improper. Nothing in it was even warm from the outside. 2 people exchanging pleasantries, no closer than the length of an arm, perfectly civil. But Margaret had spent 2 years watching Edward have conversations. She knew his face. She knew the difference between the face he showed the world and the face that appeared without his permission. She'd seen it for 30 seconds just now. She picked up her wine, smiled at something Lady Harcastle was saying, said something back that made Lady Harcastle laugh. Her mind was elsewhere entirely. Across the room, Clara Voss was speaking to Lady Grantham, animated, relaxed, entirely recovered from 3 minutes ago. Margaret watched her. She thought, so that's what she's like. She thought, that's going to be a problem. She thought, not for long. Dinner was announced. Edward was seated at the far end of the table, host's prerogative, the Duke placed where he'd anchor the conversation. Margaret was closer to Lady Grantham. Clara was seated in the middle, between a retired general and a clergyman, neither of whom looked especially stimulating. Margaret watched Clara talk to the general, watched her lean in slightly when something interested her, watched her laugh, a laugh that arrived quickly, genuine, slightly ahead of itself. She glanced at Edward. He was looking at something his dinner partner had said, attentive, nodding. But his gaze moved, just once, just briefly, not even enough for anyone else to catch, down the length of the table. To Clara. Back again. Immediately. The whole thing took a second. Margaret looked down at her soup. She ate it slowly. She thought about a name said in the dark at 3 a.m. She thought about 4 months of ridiculous engagement 2 years ago that she had handled, that she had ended cleanly and completely, and without leaving evidence. She thought about Clara Voss laughing at a retired general's story. She picked up her wine. The first time, she thought, I did it from a distance. Letters and rumors and pressure applied in the right places. She set the glass down. This time she's in the same room. After dinner, the women withdrew. Clara found herself near the fire, which was where everyone gravitated in Lady Grantham's house because it was the only room that wasn't aggressively heated, and the fireplace was the warmest spot in it. She was talking to a woman she'd just met, a pleasant, vague woman who collected watercolors and wanted to know if her niece might take lessons, when she became aware of someone arriving beside her. She knew before she turned. Margaret Ashford was everything the rumors suggested, and a few things they didn't. Beautiful in the particular way of women who understood beauty as an instrument. Composed. Not warm, but performing warmth so well that most people probably couldn't tell the difference. Miss Voss, she said, pleasantly, I understand you've been teaching Lucy Grantham. For 2 months, she's progressing very well. Wonderful. The smile stayed exactly where it was. We must have met before, surely. You look familiar. Clara looked at her. She knew this face, not from meeting, they'd never met, but she knew what this was. She'd grown up without money in rooms full of people who had it, and she recognized a woman who was deciding something about her. "I don't think we have," Clara said. "No," Margaret said thoughtfully, "perhaps not." A pause, small and precisely placed. "My husband mentioned he'd spoken with you this evening. He's very fond of music." "Many people are." "Yes," the smile again. "Well, I hope we see more of you, Miss Voss. These gatherings are always more interesting with new faces." She moved away. Clara stood at the fireplace and looked at the flames and breathed very carefully for a moment. New faces. She'd been in London for 2 months. She'd been careful. She'd been so careful. Taking pupils in households that had no connection to the Ashford world, keeping to the edges, building something small and manageable and safe. 2 months of careful. One evening to undo it. She looked across the room at Margaret Ashford, who was laughing at something Lady Grantham had said, head tilted, diamonds catching the light. She knows, Clara thought. She didn't know how, she didn't know what exactly, but she'd been in enough rooms to know when someone had decided she was a problem. She was a problem. She would need to decide what to do with that. It started with a comment. Just a comment, the kind that didn't announce itself as a weapon, the kind that sounded almost like concern. Lady Harcastle's drawing room, Thursday afternoon tea. 6 women, good china, the comfortable rhythm of people who had known each other long enough to stop being careful. Margaret set down her cup. Has anyone else heard about the music teacher, the one Lady Grantham's been using for Lucy? A murmur. A few had met her at the dinner. Sweet girl, someone said. Margaret's expression was thoughtful, slightly reluctant, the way it was when she was about to say something she hadn't quite decided to say. She set down her cup. She let the silence do the rest. By Friday, the comment had become a question. By Monday, the question had become a concern. By Wednesday, Lady Grantham had heard it third hand. Something about Miss Voss and a previous employer, something vague and unspecified, the worst kind of rumor because there was nothing concrete enough to disprove. Lady Grantham was not a cruel woman, but she had a daughter and a reputation, and the rumor was just specific enough to be worrying and just vague enough to be impossible to dismiss. She wrote Clara a letter, very apologetic. Lucy had made such progress, but circumstances had changed, perhaps in the spring. Clara read it at the kitchen table of her small rented room in Kensington. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat very still for a moment, the way she did when something needed to be absorbed before it could be dealt with. 1 pupil. She had 4 others. She would manage. She wrote Lady Grantham a polite reply and went to give her Tuesday lesson in Mayfair. She didn't know about the comment in Lady Harcastle's drawing room. She didn't know about the letter Margaret had sent to Mrs. Fellows, who hosted Clara's Tuesday pupil, mentioning with apparent casualness that she'd heard Miss Voss was looking for a position in Bath. Such a shame, she seems talented, but I imagine she won't be in London much longer. Mrs. Fellows, who had been considering extending Clara's contract, filed this information away. She didn't know about the conversation at the Cavendish Club, the ladies' branch, the one where Margaret's mother held considerable influence, where the name Voss had come up in the context of reliability and stability, and whether it was wise to bring unknown young women into one's household. Clara knew none of this. She just knew that Mrs. Fellows seemed cooler on Tuesday, that the lesson ran short, that there was no mention of next month's schedule. She walked home through the February cold and told herself it was probably nothing. Edward knew nothing. He went about his days, the House of Lords, the estate correspondence, the dinners he was required to attend and the meetings he was required to take. He and Margaret moved through the Ashford townhouse in the well-practiced way they had developed over 2 years, politely, efficiently, without friction. He thought about Clara. This was not new. He'd been thinking about Clara since October of 1841, which was when he'd made the worst decision of his life at the age of 26 and had been making peace with it ever since. What was new was the specific quality of the thinking. It had texture now, detail, the particular aliveness of something that had been abstract and was suddenly real again. He'd seen her face when she looked at him, that flash before the door closed. He told himself not to make something of it. He told himself a great many things and believed approximately half of them. He didn't know that 3 miles away, Clara's Tuesday lesson had just been canceled by letter. He didn't know about Thursday's drawing room. He didn't know that his wife was doing what his wife did, precisely, efficiently, without friction. He went to his club on Wednesday. He read the papers. He had dinner with a colleague who talked about railway investment for 2 hours. He came home. Margaret was reading in the sitting room. She looked up when he came in. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he said. She went back to her book. He went to his study. By the end of February, Clara had lost 2 pupils. She sat with her accounts on a Sunday evening, the small desk in her small room, the lamp turned low to save oil, and looked at the numbers and thought carefully and practically about what they meant. She had 2 pupils left, 2 lessons a week, enough for the room and the food, and nothing else, which meant her father's small needs couldn't be met from this month's income, which meant she needed to find more work, which meant placing advertisements, which meant time she didn't have. She put the pen down. She thought about Lady Grantham's letter, about Mrs. Fellowes going cool, about the Tuesday lesson that had simply stopped. No real explanation. Circumstances have changed. She thought about a woman in green silk at a fireplace saying "new faces" with a smile that didn't reach anything. She picked the pen back up. She was not, she told herself, going to draw conclusions without evidence. She was not going to become the kind of person who saw patterns where there were none, who blamed misfortune on malice when misfortune was simply misfortune. She placed 2 advertisements in the Thursday papers. She waited. Neither of them received a reply. It was Mrs. Hobson who told her. Mrs. Hobson was the landlady of the building, a practical, unsentimental woman in her 60s who had seen a great deal and had opinions about most of it. She and Clara had developed the careful friendship of 2 women sharing a building, the kind that was mostly practical and occasionally real. She knocked on Clara's door on a Wednesday morning with a look that said she'd been thinking about whether to say something for several days and had decided she would. "You've had inquiries," she said, "about you, from a woman. I didn't know her, but she was quality, you could see it, very pleasant. She asked how long you'd been here, whether you had visitors, whether you were—" She paused. "Whether you were the sort of person one could rely on." Clara looked at her. "What did you tell her?" she said. "The truth," Mrs. Hobson said, "that you've been here 2 months, that you're perfectly respectable, and that you're an excellent tenant." A pause. She didn't seem pleased to hear it. No, I imagine she didn't. After Mrs. Hobson left, she sat at her desk and she looked at the wall and she thought about green silk and diamond earrings and a smile like a door that only opened from the inside. She thought about Edward, about his face when he'd seen her, that 1 second, that unguarded second before everything became proper and correct again. She thought about whether she should leave London. She thought about the advertisements that had received no reply. She thought about her father in Hampshire, with his quiet needs and his frail health, and the money she sent home every month. She put her hands flat on the desk. She thought about a 26-year-old man who had stood at a window and watched her go and hadn't come after her. She thought about a 30-year-old woman who had spent 2 years building something small from nothing and was not going to let it be dismantled again by someone who saw her as a loose end. She lifted her chin. She picked up her pen. She wrote a letter to a Mrs. Calder in Bloomsbury, whose advertisement for a piano instructor she'd seen in the Thursday papers and had hesitated over because Bloomsbury was farther than she liked to travel. She stopped hesitating. She sealed it. She addressed it. She put on her coat. She was still here. For now, that would have to be enough. He heard it at his club. Not from anyone important, from Fellows, of all people, Mrs. Fellows' husband, a mild-mannered man who collected stamps and rarely said anything worth remembering. They were standing at the bar on a Thursday afternoon, the conversation going nowhere in particular, when Fellows mentioned that his wife had let go of the music teacher. "The Voss girl," he said. "Shame, really. Lucy Grantham's mother recommended her highly, but Eleanor heard something, I don't even know what, some drawing room thing, and you know how these things go." Edward looked at his drink. "What sort of thing?" he said, carefully. Fellows waved a hand. "Something about her reliability. I didn't follow the details. Eleanor didn't either, honestly. She just said the name had come up in a way that made her uncomfortable." He signaled the barman. "Sam again?" "No," Edward said. "Thank you." He put his glass down and thought for a moment. Then he went home. He didn't go to Margaret. Not yet. He went to his study and he sat at his desk and he thought, carefully, methodically, the way he approached things when he didn't want to think too fast and get it wrong. Something about her reliability. He thought about Lady Grantham's daughter, whose lesson had apparently also ended. He thought about advertisements placed and not replied to. He didn't know about those yet, but he knew Clara, knew how she worked, knew she wouldn't have sat still while her income disappeared. He thought about his wife. He thought about how precisely and efficiently his wife managed things she wanted managed. He sat with it for a long time. Then he rang for his secretary. It took 4 days. His secretary was a discreet and capable man who understood, without being told, the difference between inquiries that needed to be officially documented and ones that didn't. By Monday, he had confirmed 3 things. First, Clara had lost 2 pupils in February. Both losses had followed conversations in which her name had come up. Conversations that traced back through 2 or 3 removes to a single source. 2 advertisements she'd placed in the Thursday papers had received no replies, which was unusual enough for someone of her reputation. The advertisements had been noted, it seemed, by people who had been noted by other people to keep an eye. Third, and this was the one that sat heaviest, there was a debt. Her father's debt, called in suddenly 3 years ago. The account had been acquired, shortly before it was called in, by a financial house that managed investments for several prominent families, including the Cavendishes, Margaret's family. Edward sat with this for a long time. He thought about Clara's father in his small parlor, saying, "She's not the kind of girl who'll be comfortable being a duchess." He thought about a Wednesday morning when Clara had come to his study and said, "Is your mother approaching other families?" And he had been silent 1 second too long. He thought about how he'd told himself it was just the pressure, just the adjustment, just the family coming around. He thought about what he had actually allowed to happen. He put the papers in his drawer. He went to find Clara. She was at the Calder house in Bloomsbury. He waited outside. He hadn't announced himself. He knew she wouldn't have agreed to see him if he had, and he needed to see her in a way that didn't leave her the option of a polite refusal by letter. She came out at 3:30, coat buttoned against the March cold, the leather satchel she always carried over one shoulder. She came down the steps and turned toward the street and stopped. He was standing on the pavement. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said, and then, after a pause, "This feels deliberate." "It is," he said. "Will you walk with me?" She looked at him for a moment. the expression he remembered, the one that thought before it committed to anything. "Briefly," she said. They walked. The streets of Bloomsbury in March, gray and cold, the trees just beginning to consider the idea of leaves. He matched her pace, which was quick, and she didn't slow it for him, which felt correct. He said, "I know what's been happening." She said nothing. "The lessons, the advertisements, my secretary." He stopped. "It's Margaret." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew?" "I suspected," she said. 2 months ago." She kept walking. "I didn't know how to prove it, and I didn't see what proving it would accomplish." "Clara." "Don't," she said. Same word she'd said 2 years ago, same voice. He stopped walking. She walked 2 more steps, then stopped, turned around. They stood on the pavement looking at each other, and the distance between them was 10 feet, and also 2 years, and also everything that had happened in those 2 years and hadn't been said. "I know what I did 2 years ago. I know what I allowed." She looked at him. Her face was controlled, not cold, not angry, the controlled expression of someone who had spent considerable time getting this particular feeling under regulation and was not pleased to have it disturbed.
"You let them pressure you," she said. "You were 26, and you were the Duke of Harrow, and you had your family, and your title, and all of it pressing on you, and you folded." A pause. "I understood it. I didn't like it, but I understood it." "That's not—" He stopped. "You deserved better than understanding." "Yes," she said. "I did." He felt the truth of it, the flat, clean truth of it land somewhere it needed to land. "And now," he said quietly, "she's doing it again, taking your pupils, and you're managing it alone because it isn't your problem," Clara said. "It is my problem." "It is your wife's actions," she said, "which makes it your problem in one sense and not your problem in every other sense." She looked at him. "What exactly are you proposing to do, Edward?" His name. He hadn't heard it from her in 2 years. He looked at her, at the careful face, the controlled expression, and underneath it the thing he'd seen for 1 second at Lady Grantham's dinner before the door had closed. The thing that was still there, that had apparently survived 2 years of his failure and his absence, and his name said in someone else's bed in the dark. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I'm not folding this time." She looked at him for a long moment. "You said that," she said, "or something like it the last time, before you went quiet." "I know." "And then you married her." "I know." The wind moved through the street. Somewhere nearby, a cart horse shifted and stamped. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to give me the chance to show you the difference." She looked at him. For a moment, her face did the thing it sometimes did, the thing he'd seen on a Tuesday afternoon in October when he'd asked her a question and she'd said yes and then laughed, surprised at herself. The thing that happened when Clara Voss felt something she hadn't fully decided to feel yet. She looked away. "I have another lesson Friday," she said, "in Holborn." "I know. Mrs. Calder's niece." She glanced at him. "You've been thorough." "I have been. I should have been 2 years ago." A pause. "Go home, Edward," she said, not unkindly. She turned and walked away. He stood on the pavement and watched her go, same as 2 years ago, same coat, same pace, and this time he didn't tell himself he'd fix it tomorrow. This time he meant today. He hadn't noticed the carriage. It had been parked on the opposite side of the street when he arrived, an ordinary-looking carriage, the kind that moved through London in its hundreds, unremarkable. He hadn't given it a thought. Margaret had. She'd followed him from the club,
Not herself, she wasn't careless, and when his secretary's inquiries had begun, she'd understood what was coming. She'd positioned herself where she needed to be. She sat inside the carriage now, on the opposite side of the street, and she watched Edward watch Clara Voss walk away. She watched his face. That was the part that settled it. Not the conversation. She hadn't been close enough to hear the conversation, but the face. She knew his face. She knew the face he used for obligation and duty and the correct performance of feeling. That was not that face. She sat back. Outside, Edward turned and walked in the other direction, hands in his coat pockets, jaw set. Margaret pulled the carriage blind down. She thought about 2 years ago, about how efficient it had been, about letters and debts and rumors placed in the right ears, the whole thing resolved in 4 months without anyone connecting it to her. She thought about Clara Voss, who had apparently come back to London and gotten 2 months of footing before Margaret had found her. She thought about a piano teacher from Hampshire who had lost 2 pupils and placed 2 advertisements and found new pupils anyway. She had underestimated her. She wouldn't do that again. "Home," she said to the driver. She rode back through the London streets, and she planned. Margaret waited 3 days. This was deliberate. She'd learned early that the most effective thing you could do after someone made a move was wait. Let them think they'd gotten away with something. Let them relax. Let them start to believe the conversation on the pavement had changed something. Then move. She chose a Tuesday morning. Edward had a committee meeting at 10 that would keep him occupied until at least 1 o'clock. She had the house to herself, or effectively so. She went to his study. Not snooping, she was too careful for snooping, too careful to leave evidence of having been somewhere. She simply stood in the middle of the room and looked at it the way she looked at everything, as a problem to be assessed. The secretary's report was in the locked drawer. She didn't have the key and didn't need it. She already knew what was in it. What she needed was to know how far Edward was prepared to go. She thought about his face on the pavement. She had her answer. She was in the sitting room when he came home. She'd arranged herself carefully, not too studied, not staged, reading or appearing to. The fire going, the room warm. She waited until he'd settled, until she heard him moving through the hall, and then she set her book down. "Edward," she called, "come and sit down a moment." He appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, the particular alertness of a man who had realized, a fraction of a second too late, that the room he was walking into had been prepared for him. He came in anyway. He sat. She looked at him pleasantly. "I want to talk about Clara Voss," she said. He didn't flinch. She'd give him that. He looked at her steadily and said, "All right." "I know you've been looking into things," she said. "Your secretary is discreet but not invisible, and I know you met with her last week." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's been happening, and I'd rather we didn't pretend together. It wastes time." "Fine," he said. "Then let's not pretend." "She needs to go," Margaret said, simply, finally. "That's all. She needs to leave London, leave your orbit, and this, whatever this is, needs to stop before it becomes something that can't be managed." "There's nothing to manage," Edward said. "Not yet," she said. "But I've seen your face, Edward. I heard your name in the dark for 3 nights running." She paused. Let that land. Let him understand that she'd known since January, that she'd been patient. "So let's not pretend there's nothing to manage." He was quiet. "If you end it now," she said, "nothing changes. We continue as we are. I won't pursue her further. The lessons, the disruptions, all of it stops. You have my word." She looked at him steadily. "That's a reasonable offer." "And if I don't?" he said. She looked at him. Then I will make a scandal, she said. Not a rumor, not a drawing room comment, a scandal. I will go to your mother, to the committee chairs you work with, to every person whose opinion matters to the Ashford name, and I will tell them that my husband has been pursuing a former, whatever she was, while married to me. A pause. And I'll make sure the story is detailed enough to be believed, and vague enough that you can't disprove it. I've done it before. The last sentence arrived quietly, almost gently. Edward looked at her. 2 years ago, he said. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She just held his gaze. You arranged the debt, her father's debt. I arranged a great many things, she said. I do what needs doing. That's what I've always done. Clara, he said. Her name in his mouth, different from how he said anything else, which was exactly the problem. You destroyed her life. I protected mine and yours, though you didn't appreciate it at the time. She stood. The conversation was over. She'd said what needed saying. Think about it, Edward. You have a week. She went to the door. Margaret. She turned. He was still sitting, but the look on his face had changed. Not angry, past angry. Something colder than anger and more certain. I should tell you, he said, quietly, that I'm not 26 anymore. She looked at him. Then she left the room. She went to Clara the next morning. She told herself this was strategic, that seeing the woman directly, assessing her properly, was useful information. This was partially true. The other part was something she didn't examine closely. Clara's building in Kensington was precisely what Margaret had expected, decent but modest, the kind of address that required careful management of limited resources. She'd sent no note ahead. Notes allowed refusal. She knocked. Clara answered the door herself, which meant no maid, which Margaret filed away. She was in her day dress, hair up simply, a piece of sheet music in her hand. She looked at Margaret. She didn't look surprised. Your Grace, she said. Miss Voss, Margaret said. May I come in? A pause. Brief. No, Clara said. Margaret looked at her. Then we'll speak here, Clara said, and waited. Margaret had prepared for several versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for the door staying closed. She adjusted. I'll be direct, she said. I find directness saves time. I've been told that about you, Clara said. Then you'll appreciate that I'm here to ask you something simple. What do you want? She looked at her steadily. Not in the abstract. Practically, what outcome are you hoping for? I'm hoping, Clara said, to teach piano and pay my rent. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean, Clara said, and I'm telling you that what I want is to teach piano and pay my rent. Everything else is not something I'm pursuing. You had a conversation with my husband on a public pavement, Margaret said. He came to find me. Yes, Margaret said, he did. She looked at the woman in the doorway, at the self-possession, the stillness, the sheet music still in her hand as though this conversation were a minor interruption in her morning. Let me ask you something else, then. Do you know what he did 2 years ago? Clara's expression didn't change. He let you go, Margaret said, when it mattered, when his family pressed him, when it cost him something. He folded. He married me. She held her gaze. I'm not telling you something you don't know. I'm asking you to consider what it means. A pause, precisely placed. He'll do it again. Something moved in Clara's face, small, gone quickly. People change, Clara said.
Men like Edward don't change, Margaret said. They mean well, they feel things genuinely, and when it costs them something real, when it's their title, or their family, or their position in the world, they choose those things every time. She said it without cruelty, which was worse than cruelty. You know this, you lived it. Clara looked at her. What exactly, she said, are you hoping I'll do? Leave London, go back to Hampshire. There's nothing here for you that's worth what it's going to cost you. She reached into her reticulate. I'm prepared to be generous. Your father's needs.
Stop, Clara said. Margaret stopped. Put that away, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it. Not anger, something that came from further down than anger. And then I'd like you to leave. Miss Voss, you've been to my pupils, Clara said. You've placed rumors. You had my father's debt called in. She looked at Margaret directly, without flinching. You've done everything in your power to make my life impossible, and now you're standing at my door with money and a speech about how Edward will fail me. A pause. I'm still here. Margaret looked at her. He will fail you, she said again, more quietly. Perhaps, Clara said, but that will be between him and me. There is no him and... Please go, Clara said. Your Grace. The door closed. Not slammed. Quietly. Firmly. The latch clicking into place like a sentence ending. Margaret stood on the landing. She stood there for a moment, which was not something she usually did. Standing still in unexpected places was not her habit. She thought about the woman on the other side of the door. She thought, for the first time in this entire business, about what it would be like to be Clara Voss. To have built something small from very little, twice now. To have had it dismantled, twice. To have opened a door to the Duchess of Harrow and said, I'm still here. She put the thought away. She went downstairs. She sat in her carriage, and she breathed for a moment. Then she thought about what came next, about the scandal she'd threatened Edward with, about the week she'd given him, about how much of this she was actually prepared to do. She looked at her own hands in her lap. She thought, she's not going to leave. She thought, he's not going to fold. She thought, I am running out of moves. She pulled down the blind, and the carriage moved off into the London morning, and she sat in the dark of it and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific cold of a person who has played every card they have and is still losing. But only for a moment. Then she thought of one more. The week passed. Margaret waited. She was good at waiting. It was, in many ways, her greatest skill. She went to dinners and teas and morning calls, and she smiled, and she talked, and she watched the clock in the back of her mind count down. Edward said nothing. He was in the house. He ate, he worked, he was present in the way he'd always been present, which was to say, correctly, efficiently, without warmth. This was normal. She'd stopped expecting warmth from him in the first 6 months. But something had changed. She couldn't have said exactly what. Not in anything he did. He was as precise and correct as always. Something in how he did it. A quality of resolution she hadn't felt from him before, like a man who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment. The week ended on a Friday. He came to find her. She was in the morning room. He closed the door, which he rarely did when he came to speak to her. Closed doors were for arguments, and she and Edward didn't argue. They managed each other with too much precision for argument. She put down her letter. You've had your week, she said. I have, he said. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room and he looked at her, and she read his face and she knew, before he said a word, she knew. She kept her expression exactly where it was. I'm not going to do what you asked, he said. Edward, let me finish. Not loud, quiet, the way he said everything important. "I've been thinking about what I want to say, and I'd like to say it without interruption." She gestured. "Go on." "This marriage," he said, "has been exactly what we both made it. Functional, correct. I've been a faithful husband and a responsible duke, and I have never, at any point in 2 years, given you cause for a legitimate grievance." He held her gaze. "What I feel for Clara Voss, what I have always felt, has never been acted on, not once. Whatever you heard in the dark, whatever you saw on a pavement in Bloomsbury, that's all it was, feeling. Nothing improper has occurred." "Yet," she said. "The word doesn't change the fact." He paused. "You have no scandal, Margaret. You have a husband who said a name in his sleep and met an old acquaintance at a dinner and had a 10-minute conversation on a public street. Take that to anyone you like. Take it to my mother, to the committee chairs, to every drawing room in London." A pause, "and see what they make of it." She looked at him. He was right. She knew he was right. She'd known it since she'd sat in the dark of the carriage outside Claire's building and felt the first real cold of this situation settling in. The scandal she'd threatened was real, but its power depended on Edward being afraid of it. A man who wasn't afraid of it was a man she couldn't threaten. "You'd let me destroy your reputation," she said. "You'd destroy your own," he said. "A wife who accuses her husband of impropriety that can't be proven destroys herself along with him. You know this better than anyone." She sat very still. "What are you saying?" she said. "Exactly." He looked at her. "I'm saying this marriage is over in every way that matters," he said. "It probably was before it started, if I'm honest, which I should have been 2 years ago and wasn't." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything formal yet. I'm not making announcements, but I'm telling you clearly, so there's no confusion between us. I'm done managing this. I'm done pretending it's something it isn't." "And Clara Voss," she said, "is nothing to do with you," he said. "Not anymore." The morning room was very quiet. Outside, London went about its business. A cart on the street, a door somewhere in the house, the fire. Margaret looked at her husband, at this man she'd chosen not because she loved him, but because he was exactly the right shape for the life she wanted, the right name, the right position, the right everything except the one thing she'd never asked for and didn't need. She'd never needed him to love her. She'd needed him to stay. "You're making a mistake," she said. "I made my mistake 2 years ago," he said. "I'm correcting it." "She may not want to be corrected too," Margaret said. "Have you considered that? That she's spent 2 years building a life without you, and you, with your good intentions and your week of thinking, may be rather too late?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I've considered it." She looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the certainty, the thing that had been missing for 2 years, that she'd always known was missing, that she'd told herself didn't matter. She had always known, somewhere she didn't visit often, that a man who couldn't hold what he wanted wasn't the kind of man who'd hold what he had. "Get out of my morning room," she said. He left. She sat alone for a long time afterward. She thought about the scandal, ran through it, the real version of it, stripped of the threat, just the facts, what she had, what she could prove, what any reasonable person hearing it would conclude. Edward was right. She had a name said in a fever, a 10-minute conversation, a former attachment 2 years dissolved, which Edward had never hidden. Everyone who'd known him in 41 had known about Clara Voss. It wasn't a secret, it was just old news. She had nothing. She'd burned her resources dismantling something that had reassembled itself in a room she hadn't been watching. She thought about Clara at the door. "I'm still here." She thought about Edward. "I'm not 26 anymore." She pressed her lips together. She picked up her letter and looked at it without reading it. There was one more thing she could do. One. She'd thought of it in the carriage, in the dark, after the closed door and the quiet latch. She thought about it now. She thought about what kind of woman she was, and what kind of woman she wanted to be, and whether there was any distance between those two things. She put the letter down. She didn't do the last thing. Not today. Perhaps not at all. She went to her room, and she sat at her vanity, and she looked at herself in the glass for a long time. She was 31. She was beautiful and capable, and she had managed a household and a social position and a loveless marriage with more competence than most people brought to things they actually wanted. She had done all of this. She had also, she thought, spent 3 years fighting for something that had never been hers. Not Edward. She'd never wanted Edward, not really. The position, the life, the shape of things. She'd fought for the shape of things. She thought about how exhausting it was. She looked at her own face in the glass. She thought, when did I become this? She didn't have an answer that she liked. She rang for her maid. She changed for the afternoon. She went to Lady Harcastle's for tea, where she was charming and composed, and everyone was delighted to see her. She laughed 3 times. None of them were real. Edward, meanwhile, had put on his coat and left the house. He walked. He did this when he needed to think. The streets, the movement, the city that didn't care who he was or what he'd just done. He walked south, toward the river, without a particular destination. He thought about what he'd said. He thought about what came next. He'd told Margaret the truth. Nothing had happened between him and Clara. A pavement conversation, a name. 2 years of carrying something that had never been resolved. Clara had told him to go home. She hadn't said, "Don't come back." He walked along the embankment, the river gray and wide and indifferent, and he thought about a woman in a doorway with sheet music in her hand who had told a duchess to leave and then closed the door quietly. And he felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Not happiness. It was too early for happiness. There was too much between here and anything resembling happiness. But something lighter than what had been there before. Like a room with a window opened in it. He turned back toward the city. He had something to do. He came on a Saturday morning. No secretary sent ahead, no letter, just a knock at the door. And when Clara opened it, Edward standing on the landing with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had decided something and was prepared to stand behind it. She looked at him. "You again," she said. "Me again," he said. She stepped back from the door. She made tea because it gave her hands something to do. He sat at her small kitchen table, too large for it, the Duke of Harrow in a Kensington kitchen, hat on the chair beside him, and waited while she moved around the room. She was aware of him the way you were aware of weather, constantly, peripherally, whether you looked directly at it or not. She set the cups down, sat across from him. He looked at her. "I spoke to Margaret," he said. "I know," she said. "She came here first." Something moved across his face. "What did she say?" "What she always says," she said, "that you'll fold, that when it costs you something real, you'll choose your title and your family, and she'll be right and I'll be in Hampshire again." She wrapped her hands around her cup. She said it more elegantly than that. "She's not right," he said. "You said that before." "I know. The difference is that this time I have already done something about it." He looked at her steadily. "I told her the marriage is over. Not formally, not yet. These things take time, and I won't pretend otherwise. But between us, in that house, it's done." Clara looked at him. "Your mother," she said, "will not be pleased. Your seat on the committee. I'll manage it. The Ashford name." "Clara, quiet. I know what you're doing." She stopped. "You're listing the things that undid me last time. You're checking whether any of them still work. He held her gaze. They don't. I've already considered every one of them, and I'm telling you they don't.
She looked at him, at this man who had sat in a small parlor 2 years ago and been silent 1 second too long, and who was sitting in her small kitchen now, with his hat on the wrong chair and his hands flat on the table, and not a single flinch in him. People don't change, she said. Or they don't change enough. Or they change until it costs them something, and then they go back to what they were. Yes, he said. Sometimes. Your wife said the same thing. My wife, he said carefully, is very intelligent and has been entirely wrong about most things that matter. A pause. She was right about one thing. I let you go. I stood at a window and watched you leave, and I told myself I'd fix it tomorrow. He looked at her. There's no tomorrow in this, Clara. This is the conversation. This is the one that counts. She was quiet. Outside, the Saturday morning went about itself. Someone on the street below, the distant clatter of a market, ordinary sounds. The sounds of a life that had been, for 2 years, small and carefully managed, and hers. She thought about Hampshire, about the spring she'd packed a bag and gone back to her father's house, and sat in the room she'd grown up in, and looked at the ceiling, and decided, very deliberately, to be all right. She'd been all right. She'd come back to London. She'd built something. She'd withstood Margaret's campaign with her chin up and her door closed, and her ledger balanced to the penny. She'd been all right. But all right, she thought, was not the same as what she'd felt on a Tuesday afternoon in October when she'd said yes and then laughed, surprised at herself, at the sheer improbable fact of it. She'd been trying, for 2 years, not to think about the difference. If you do this, she said slowly, and then something happens, your family, the title, anything, and you fold again, I won't. But if you do, she said, I won't survive it a second time. Not intact. You should know that. He looked at her. He didn't look away. I know, he said. That's why I need you to believe me. He paused. 2 years ago, I didn't protect you. I let them, my family, her family, all of it. I let them move around you like you were a piece on a board, and I stood back and I told myself it wasn't my fault. His voice was steady, but there was something under it, something that had been held for a long time. It was my fault, entirely, and I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word for something that large. I'm asking you to let me... He stopped. I'm asking you to let me be, this time, what I should have been then. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him, at his hands on her table, at the hat on the wrong chair, at the face she'd spent 2 years trying to think about less. You said the decision was mine, she said. It is, he said. It always was. I'm just here. This time, I'm here. She sat with it. She sat with all of it. The 2 years, the packed bag, the closed door, the ledger balanced to the penny, the advertisements that hadn't been answered, the Duchess on her landing with money in her reticule, and underneath all of that, below all the practical, sensible things, the things she'd been careful not to look at directly, that she had never, not once, stopped. She looked at her hands around the teacup. Then she set the cup down. She put her hand on the table, open, still in the space between them. She didn't look at him when she did it. She looked at her own hand. It was, she thought, the bravest thing she'd done in 2 years, and that was saying something. His hand covered hers, warm, certain, not going anywhere. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the one from the parlor, from a Tuesday afternoon, from before everything had gone wrong,
like she was the only solid thing in the room. "All right," she said quietly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Margaret heard about it on a Wednesday. Not from Edward. He told her formally, correctly, with the document his solicitor had prepared, which set out the terms of a legal separation with the precision of a man who had been planning it carefully and had no intention of being argued out of it. She read the document. She read it again. She signed it. Not because she had no choice. She had choices. She always had choices. She was Margaret Ashford, and she had never been without options. But she sat at her writing desk and she read the document, and she thought about a kitchen and a hand on a table and a woman who had said, "I'm still here," twice now. And she thought about a carriage in the dark and the cold feeling of running out of moves. And she thought about what the solicitor had told Edward, that the grounds could be established, that the financial arrangements would be handled, that she would keep the London house and a sufficient income and her place in society, which was more than most women in her position received, and she knew it. She thought about 31 years old, and what came next. She signed the document. She sent it back. She sat alone in her morning room for a long time. She was not, she told herself, going to feel sorry for herself. She had done what she'd done with clear eyes, and she would live with it with the same clarity. But she thought, once, quietly, about what it might have been like to want something real, to have fought for something that was actually worth having. Then she rang for her maid. She had a dinner on Friday. She would be charming and composed, and everyone would be delighted to see her. She would manage. She always managed. 3 months later. The piano in the Harrow Estates music room had not been played in 2 years. This was corrected on a Thursday afternoon in June, when Clara sat down at it for the first time and played a scale. Just a scale. Just checking the tuning, running her hands along the keys the way she always did with an instrument she hadn't met yet. It was slightly flat on the upper register. She'd have someone look at it. "Well," Edward said from the doorway. "The action is good," she said. "It needs tuning. Someone hasn't been playing it." "Someone hasn't been doing a great many things," he said. "I'm hoping to change that." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and the expression he used when he was trying not to show that something mattered to him, which she had learned meant it mattered a great deal. She turned back to the piano. She played the opening bars of the piece she'd been working on, the one she'd been playing the night they met at the Hartleys, the one she'd chosen because she loved it, and not because anyone was listening. She heard him cross the room. He sat beside her on the bench. Too close, technically. They were married, but only recently, and she was still getting used to the weight of him beside her in ordinary moments, and he didn't say anything. He listened. She played. The music room was warm. Outside, the June garden was doing what June gardens did, extravagantly, without apology. The windows were open and the smell of it came in, green and bright, nothing like a February street or a Kensington landing or the gray specific cold of 2 years of managing. She finished the piece. The last note hung in the air for a moment. "That's the one," he said quietly, from the Hartley evening. "Yes," she said. "I stood at the back of the room," he said. "I forgot entirely what I'd been talking about." "I know," she said. "I could tell." He looked at her. "You could tell? You were very obvious for a duke." He laughed. She felt it rather than heard it, the warmth of it, close. She looked at the keys. "I should have come after you, that spring. I should have—" "Yes," she said, "you should have." She paused.
But you're here now. I'm here now, he said. She put her hands back on the keys. She played the opening bars again, from the beginning, because some things were worth starting over. He stayed beside her. Outside, June continued without them, bright and unhurried, the whole long summer still ahead.
Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.